there's two areas. One is design good clinical studies. So I'm involved a little bit with the magic mushrooms, the psilocybin, the medicinal cannabis for pain, etc. So I'm involved with those.
Welcome back to another episode of HPG Engage, the podcast. Today I have Professor Adrian Bootes. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. How are you today?
I'm well, thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for sitting down with us today. We find here at HPG that your career has been very interesting. You've done a lot, and you've made a massive influence on healthcare across the world, and also particularly in Australia. You are the Director of Drug Development and Regulatory Affairs at my medical department.
Correct.
And you also are the principal consultant as well for your own advisory business. Is that correct?
CR Consult.
And how has that been for you?
That's been fabulous. It gives me an opportunity really to put people on the right path with their new medicine or device. There's a lot of entrepreneurs out there who need to make sure they spend their money wisely and they develop sort of their product to really capitalize on the patient benefits. So I think there's a dearth of that in Australia, and it's really been good for them.
Amazing. And obviously before you started your consultancy business, you worked for Roche for about 16 years. You had a tenure with the TGA. You also did tenure with ARCS as well. So you've done quite a bit. So I want to delve into a few of those, but let's bring it all the way back. How did you end up where you are today? What was the driving force behind, I guess, the early starts of your career? What did you study at university, for example? And when you were studying that, did you, I guess, envision the career progression and experiences that you would have had going through?
That's a very good question. I had some seminal sort of activities that really changed my path. When I was at high school, I was convinced by my brother to join him in pharmacy. We were going to have a chain of pharmacies at one stage. I went through a pharmacy degree at University of Sydney, and then I did postgraduate work. And that postgraduate work was in the AIDS ward in 1988, at the height of the pandemic there, with many, many people dying, sometimes within a couple of weeks of being diagnosed with AIDS, and suddenly they were dead. It was a terrible time, and with lots of drug repurposing, lots of things we didn't know, lots of drugs we used at higher doses or never used before. So I quickly came to realize that what really floated my boat was bringing new medicines to Australians, particularly in pandemic situations. So that time in the AIDS world, all those interviews I did with AIDS patients for my adverse drug reaction work was terrific, and it's really took me in another direction. From there, I always knew that I'd be joining industry rather than working on a one-to-one basis with patients, but then going to work in industry developing new medicines.
Amazing. I feel like that's such an important, the fact you studied pharmacy, because whenever we speak to our recruitment consultants, when we talk, giving people some insights, what are the type of degrees, or if you had any advice for someone just entering or wanting to enter in the industry, they say the degree that you choose to study is very important, particularly when it comes to clinical research and regulatory affairs. And they have said pharmacy is one of the ones that they would recommend people studying.
Yeah, pharmacy I find is particularly good for regulatory affairs because you cover the clinical side, the patient side, but you also have an understanding of the chemistry and the manufacturing and the pharmacokinetics, pharmaceutics of medicines. So how they move around the body, how they're absorbed, how they're made, impurities and things. That's a skill set that really is suited to regulatory affairs. Clinical research, yes, pharmacy is very good for that, but there are many other degrees as well.
For sure. So let's touch on your time at Roche. You spent almost 16 years at Roche within regulatory affairs, but then you moved onwards into the clinical research space as a clinical research manager. Why did you decide to join Roche, and how was that time span of 16 years there?
Well, like most people in the industry at that time, I'd actually worked at Abbott down at Cornell at their manufacturing plant for a couple of years as a regulatory affairs associate. I wanted to join industry and I made that move. I then went to Roche as a senior regulatory affairs associate and moved up to a regulatory project manager and then regulatory affairs manager. So that was terrific. We were doing probably 3 new chemical entities per year. So we had a huge number of products coming through, but not as many indications as what you see now. So more drugs, less indications. And that was a terrific time. Unfortunately, towards the end, we had to withdraw a Parkinson's drug due to liver adverse events. We had to deal with the withdrawal of a major hypertension drug, Posicor, because of mainly drug interactions, 3A4, 2D6, which is a new sort of problem, and many people were having side effects from other medicines when they were on that blood pressure drug as well. And then after that, the cupboard was kind of bare for Roche. It was a hard time for them, and I actually looked at clinical research, saying, well, I've spent 8 or 9 years in regulatory affairs. Is this what I'm going to do for the rest of my career, or am I going to do something else? And I thought I'm going to get involved in actually researching the drugs and the clinical trials. And so I asked and was moved to a clinical research position. So I went from regulatory affairs manager back down to clinical research associate, but that was okay. I had to learn the ropes, and I worked my way up to a senior clinical research associate, a regional clinical project manager, a therapeutic area manager for oncology, and clinical research manager. So we were at the stage where we had 27 project managers and 100 staff within Australia, and we were managing trials throughout Southeast Asia and South Africa as well as Australia. So it was a very exciting time in that sort of space, and it was interesting because about that time it was the time that the factory was sold. So Abbott, which I originally worked at, closed down their factory, and Roche closed down their factory. But it was overtaken somewhat by the growth in clinical research in Australia, and that became a new focus of many of the businesses to try and get the research done here, because we did it faster, quicker, and cheaper than elsewhere, and we had high quality. So it was a significant time for the Australian industry, and for, dare I say, for the hospitals and patients.
Do you think one of the reasons why you moved from, I guess, regulatory to clinical research is because you felt like you could have more of an influence on the progress of the drugs? I guess,
I think it was broadening my experience and knowledge as well. So my first job when I came to clinical was to deal with terrible audit findings for a hepatitis C study where the investigator had just done a terrible job of actually making sure that the right patients were in the study. So I was cleaning up that mess to start with, and so certainly there were the times where you had to clean up quality, but more so we had to sort of develop new sites. So I opened up a clinical research site for oncology in Lismore, and then we built Albury and Port Macquarie and Coffs Harbour and Wollongong. So we were going through the stage where, and Hornsby Hospital for that matter, so we were placing studies with specialists who'd never seen studies before. And suddenly they were involved in an international program, and it really made their job more interesting, even in a regional centre. And that push towards regionalisation of clinical trials is continuing to this day. So it was an interesting time to sort of expand our capability as a clinical research industry, of which many other companies could then place their studies at those sites as well.
100%. Yeah. And do you think, just give people, because you mentioned that, I guess, Roche and Abbott had closed down their manufacturing.
Yes.
What was the reason behind that, do you think?
Yeah, that was very interesting. There was a real push in the 90s to go to one manufacturing site globally. We took over Syntex in 1994, and I remember going to the Syntex offices, and there were tens of thousands of pages of data there, but it wasn't clear what was actually registered in Australia, and multiple formulations, different formulations for each market. It wasn't clear what was registered, and there was a centralization for everything to Spain. So all of a sudden we were going to say, well, this is what we think we've registered to the TGA. And the TGA says, well, this is what we think you've registered as well.
Yeah.
And there were a whole bunch of gaps.
Yeah, there's a massive discrepancy between information, I guess.
A massive gap. So that's been very good for the international industry to sort of have centralization. It helps cost structures of businesses. But, you lose that manufacturing that you had in Australia. And that's now been brought to the fore with the new drugs coming out now, the RNA drugs, and I'm somewhat involved in some of the RNA products and getting factories going again in Australia, but for more targeted, smaller volume, high value add type products.
And you just touched on the TGA there, and I mean, for the majority of the public of Australia, if you'd asked them what the TGA was 5 years ago, they would not have one clue. But I guess now a lot of them would have that, because the TGA was mentioned quite a bit over the last 3 years, let's say, and you were a part of that during that time. So can you just give us a touch on your experience at the TGA? You were the assistant secretary for...
Yeah, so I was the head of prescription medicines.
Yes.
So I had about 100 staff, 40 medical specialists, about 10 or 15 pharmacists, and about 30, 40 other scientists or so, and admin staff running the program. So that was fabulous. I've actually been involved with the TGA since 1993.
Okay.
I was running conferences, the first ever conferences with them, and the first ever conferences for health economics and pricing as well, with what was then the pharmaceutical benefits branch. So that was about 1997. And then when I became CEO of ARCS, that stepped up again, where I was working to convey education for the TGA about what's happening to the sector. But you're right, everyone within industry knew the TGA, but it was only the last few years, particularly with the pandemic, that the public are aware that we've got a TGA and it's the equivalent of the US FDA.
FDA, yeah,
albeit much smaller, or the MHRA in the UK. So it's certainly, it's been a lot more prominent. And I think that's very beneficial, because the public needs trust in the regulator and the government to bring forward quality products. We know that industry's doing that, but a regulator reassuring the public to say that this medicine, yes, does work, particularly so in this group, not so much in that group. That sort of fine-tuning of a medicine is important for a regulator to give the public confidence.
100%. And during your time at the TGA, particularly over the past 3 years, there is obviously a need for drug to market quicker than usual. Yep. How were you able to, I guess, reform the structures to help respond to the demand that obviously the Australian public needed at the time?
So the Therapeutic Goods Act was written in 89 and implemented in 91, and then it's pretty much been the same for medicines. And then when I came there was an impetus to reform. So I brought in the priority pathway, the provisional pathway, which has less clinical data initially. All the COVID medicines and some oncology medicines are using that. Comparable overseas regulator A and B, using evaluation reports mainly from Europe, and also Project Orbis, which is a collaboration with Australia FDA and other major regulators on the oncology products. So it's really been, as well as the standard pathway. So I've gone from 1 to 7 pathways to bring new medicines to market. So over time, our timelines have got better and better in Australia for bringing new medicines, and more consistent and more known. But I think these just brought more options in sort of, well, where are you up to with your evaluation? Can we go earlier and get an approval for your product?
Yeah. Can
we do it faster still? Can we reuse some evaluations that are used overseas without having to do our de novo ones?
Yeah.
So those are those are some big things. I also brought in orphan reforms, and I restructured the branch somewhat to have an advanced biomedical sort of therapies area to cope with all the new medicines coming through in that space. And I also brought in a pharmacist evaluation unit to free up those 40 medical specialists so that they can concentrate on doing the bigger things faster. So there was, and some electronic forms and other things that we did. So it's been trying to make the TGA more transparent, more efficient, and making it more efficient for industry as well. I think I always found there was a lot of doubt about industry and TGA in my dealings with them over 30 years.
Yeah.
But I think there is confidence the industry does the right thing, and TGA can support the industry, but as well as being a regulator. So it's interesting. You can be the educator as well as the enforcer, and
Exactly.
that's important for a regulator to be.
You've made so many good points there, and I think, I guess that's why conversations like this are so important, because you are giving us an insight into what really was going on behind closed doors. Obviously, to the public, a lot of people would have thought these drugs are coming through quicker, but if you really were to find out what was happening, you were creating different modalities, different structures, different segments of the organizations that was allowing what usually, I guess, 30 people would be doing a certain role. You're bringing in more people that would free them up to specifically concentrate on this aspect of it.
Well, even more so because I was the Australian government representative at the first COVID meeting in Geneva in February.
Yes, I remember you mentioning that. Yeah.
In January, there was a phone call, Adrian, you need to go to Geneva. But I remember one of the head of infectious diseases at Shanghai University Hospital told me, look, day 4, they're okay. Day 5, they're in ICU. And all the infectious diseases people in the room went, oh my God. So I came back and sort of tried to get the meetings that I needed to have in health to try and get this thing. But in terms of my own branch, and other branches, I brought everyone in. So we had multiple people working on the first drugs. The first drug was Gilead's remdesivir, and it was tough actually, because I had to convince, and the local representatives of Gilead had to convince their international partners to allow us to come to Australia soon. They were worried about, well, if we've got limited resources, which country do we go to first? And Australia didn't have too much COVID then. But we were pushing, and between the local people and I, we got it, and we got our first medicine there. But even remdesivir and a lot of antivirals, they work on a specific subgroup, and it was finding out, well, when do you use that in the course of therapy? And we're learning more and more about its clinical research with real world evidence that's saying, well, where can we use these drugs the best? How can we use the vaccines the best? Particularly since this pandemic is translating to different things, new variants, new issues, etc.
And what would you have said was, I guess, the biggest roadblock when it came to, I guess, trying to navigate through all the changes that were happening so quickly?
Well, the nice thing was that everyone in TGA knew the importance of a pandemic, and the roadblocks disappeared.
Okay.
So that was nice. It's nice to see when government does big things slowly, but when in COVID they really moved quickly.
Yeah.
In many areas. In a few areas I found wanting, but generally we moved quickly, and I think that was a real. The unsung heroes, the doctors and the pharmacists and the scientists in the building, were really doing their utmost to get it through as quickly as possible. But at the same time, they're worried: do we want to give people false hope? One of the early meetings was one of the regulators was saying, well, 30% is the minimum efficacy we'd accept. Another one was saying 40%. Well, we didn't have false hope. We had drugs coming through, vaccines coming through with 70, 80, 90% efficacy.
But do you not think 30%, 40% efficacy is quite low? Or?
It was quite low, but if we've got nothing else, what do you go with?
Yeah.
So it's interesting. So when you come to a regulator and you say, well, what will you accept when you've got nothing? You have a fairly low bar, and 100%. You can raise the bar over time, and I think that's the case with many medicines and many areas. As you become better with them, you can understand, well, how can companies themselves raise the bar, or how can regulators help them raise the bar?
Amazing. And I guess moving on from your TGA, you've done quite a lot. I'm sure if people are listening right now, they've realized you've done quite a bit throughout your career, and then that's moved you into a position where you've decided to open your own consultancy firm within regulatory affairs. What was fully the driving force behind that, and how has that been going over the past?
Well, I guess throughout my career, I've tried to do a bunch of diverse things, but apply the learning from the last part to the next part. So where I think is the real thing is two areas. One is design good clinical studies. So I'm involved a little bit with the magic mushrooms, the psilocybin, the medicinal cannabis for pain, etc. So I'm involved with those. I'm dealing with people with new technologies, devices and things. So trying to point them in the right direction to get a. Because the problem is people get to regulatory affairs and then the problem stems back to they didn't do the right studies.
Okay.
So you don't think of these things as silos. Don't think of health economics, clinical research, regulatory affairs as silos. And this is one of the points I'll make maybe later, is that you need a good person understands all the facets and what each group needs. And you think about with those in mind. So with regulatory affairs, I'm often helping them design their studies better for pricing, for reimbursement. I'm also involved a little bit with people regulatory problems. People have got appeals, people have been rejected, and trying to, and some of that stems back to what I was saying before. They just haven't done their development right, or they haven't proposed their product in the right way to the regulator. And I don't like to see things with millions or tens or hundreds of millions of dollars behind them fail. I'd like to think that they come through and you can pull something out of the fire.
And how do you combat that whenever if someone comes to you and says, we've got to this point, it's been rejected? Is it a matter of going all the way back to the start and restructuring and figuring out?
Yeah, you wouldn't go back to the start and rerun a study unless you really had to. It's really sort of what can you
point of action?
What can you pull out of the fire? That sort of thing. And sometimes the regulator gets it a little bit wrong and applies the wrong bar, the wrong threshold to something. So sometimes it's a matter of understanding where to challenge and where to sort of that's the way it is. And it's very hard to resurrect maybe only a small part of what you'd hoped for. But this is what Australia needs to do better, where they need to get this drug development right from the beginning, knowing what regulators and payers need at the end, and knowing where the market's moving. I've had some experiences at TGA where people came to me and they had the best drug development for 2012, but the world moved on in the next 8 years. And then suddenly, because of that, and they didn't change their development program, they couldn't get an approval. That was very disappointing for them. I was disappointed for them.
Oh, for sure. And do you think that it stems from a standpoint that, I guess, in particular Australia, there's a lot of important when it comes to the drugs that we see, I guess, even over the counter, and it's coming from a place where Australia is almost trying to catch up. So then there's a lot of learning for them to do in order to get to a point of, let's say, clinical research in the United States, and even clinical research across the UK and Europe.
We've touched on some good parts there in that we have some gaps in the services that are provided to the industry at the moment, but also that the number of new medicines that are coming to Australia. My challenge is even in 2020, there were 35 new medicines in Australia. There were 54 in the US. Okay. So this is not part of the conversation, but it should be. Many companies aren't bringing their innovative products to Australia, and they should. So despite the extra pathways. So that's the second point. The third point I'd make is the blend of and sharing of knowledge between industry, academia, and government. So you have a lot more movement between the three sectors in some of the other jurisdictions, such as the FDA. There's a lot of ex-FDA evaluators in industry that can help guide them on their way, and so they develop good things. We don't have that as much, and so we need people to be conscious of what regulators need in Australia and elsewhere, and bring that into the conversation earlier, and bring it into the academic teaching as well, which is what I'm involved with in my professorship.
I do find that what you just stated, where there needs to be more communication between areas in healthcare, is quite a regular comment that a lot of our interviews and with other people for the podcast have said there seems to be a massive gap with communication, and some parts of industry don't know what other parts of industry are doing, and it comes from a standpoint where they think with technology and being able to store a lot of the information online, that shouldn't be the case. So what do you think is the best way to combat?
I think you have a problem with information overload. Trying to keep up with everything's going on in every field is very hard. Look, I think I think the government's actually cottoned on to this, and one of the things that's happening in New South Wales is the biomedical precinct.
Okay.
About $180 million is being put into a precinct for industry, innovators, researchers, and academia near Camperdown, and that'll be built once some of the Western distributors built underneath, and they'll be building that on top.
Yeah.
But that's what we need. We need that sharing, that transition. It's going to be very hard without the casual conversations and getting to know people in other sectors to do that. That was one of my things I was trying to do with ARCS. When I was CEO of ARCS, I was trying to bring in clinical study coordinators into the fold, and clinical investigators as well, to sort of understand that we're an ecosystem, not a silo.
Exactly.
And I think medical affairs are doing a good job of reaching out now more to investigators than what we've ever done before as well.
Perfect. So you've seen a lot of change within the healthcare landscape over the past 20 plus years, but in particular, you've been in and around regulatory affairs and clinical research. But what are some of the biggest standout changes that you've seen across those two industries in particular?
Well, for clinical research and regulatory affairs, I think the emergence of clinical research as a important part of the business in terms of getting new therapies to Australian patients, but also generating data, good quality data very quickly. We're still one of the fastest countries in the world to start clinical trials, and that's really meant that we've built up our capabilities in phase 1, phase 2 somewhat, not so much phase 3. Phase 3 is probably you go to some of the other larger countries around the world for phase 3.
Why do you think that is?
Yeah, phase 1 and 2 is really a faster start. Phase 3 is more sort of like, can you get 30 patients per site, or 50 patients per site, or 10 patients per site? And I was always...
So it's almost like a population issue, I guess.
Yeah, so this is one thing that we've got to fix with the clinical research industry, is that it's they're still quite siloed. When I do a metastatic breast cancer study feasibility at Royal Prince Alfred, I'd get, I see 50 new patients a year. No, that's wrong. It was about 10 new patients a year. And for South Korea, they'd see 50.
Okay.
Partly because they had a greater feeding area. And we've still got the problem that we don't have vast volumes of patients coming through central sites for phase 3 research. But for the early phase research, we've got a great competitive advantage in Australia.
Amazing. And what about phase 4?
Yeah, phase 4, definitely. You need to fill in the gaps with products. Phase 4, post-market research, that needs to continue. And dare I say, especially with the PD-1s, PD-L1 drugs, we at TGA were seeing 7 to 9 applications per year for new indications from BMS and MSD in particular, with many new indications coming through. So there needs to be more phase 3 research on that. So there's been fewer drugs, but with far more indications now. And with targeted medicines, it means you have to go after each individual indication. You can't just sort of get a broad hypertension thing. You're looking at individual cancers, individual subgroups of rheumatoid arthritis, et cetera, et cetera. So that might change. Mind you, we might look at looking at mechanism of action, which means that suddenly it goes across large swathes of cancers. So there's clinical research has changed a little bit. So for regulatory affairs, one of the things that we have is more reliance mechanisms. So we've got the Orbis activity, which is led by the FDA for oncology products, and then we've got the access pathway: Australia, Canada, England, Singapore, Switzerland. And so those countries are working together as strong second-tier countries with about a population of 170 million to make sure that we collectively get the products and get them approved very quickly as well. So there's more reliance and trust happening between regulators as well. I think that's very positive. We can't afford a country of 25 million to have its own pathway, its own issue. So I think that's a very positive thing for regulation as well. Just more broadly, I think unfinished business is the pricing and reimbursement. I think that's always in my career in industry, that's always been an issue. Yeah, manufacturing, pulling up and getting manufacturing in Australia again is important. I think with shipments and limited supplies, I think it's really made it clear that companies may not be able to go with one manufacturing site for the whole world.
Yeah, that's true.
Per product anymore. That's probably a luxury that doesn't consider shutdowns and COVID problems and other things.
100%. And just to finish off, lastly, do you have any advice, I guess 3 tips for someone who in particular is looking to enter into clinical research or regulatory affairs? What are some tips and tricks trying to I guess make their way through the industry?
Yeah, I think knowing the people side as well as the technical side is very important. The relationships that you build with people and with sites in clinical is very important. With regulatory, very much a technical area, but you need to understand the full business. What does marketing need? What do health economics need? What are the objectives to do? So it's thinking a little bit out. It's becoming very skilled at that area, but also understanding the greater business and hoping that they understand you as well, I think is very important. I think take the opportunities. So throughout my career, I've had international responsibilities for companies, but based out of Australia. And that's sort of saying we need someone, and my hand was volunteered, and but I've never said no.
Yeah.
So you take on those responsibilities, and they broaden your skill base. I think move around as well. It could be different companies or different roles within the one company, which is a luxury. I had many different roles at Roche, and that's why I stayed so long. But I think then thinking about doing things that are related and bringing the knowledge with you. So being CEO of ARCS for 6 years was great in terms of educating people more broadly across the sector, and being at TGA is understanding government and regulation, but also bringing a knowledge of industry and how to make things work. I don't think those pathways would have worked as well if you had a long-term public servant who'd never worked in drug regulations or clinical trials, implementing those, because you could understand where you could flex and where you need to be inflexible. Yes. to make things work on both sides.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much, Professor Adrian Bootes, for sitting down with me today. This has been very informative and very eye-opening to hear about your time at the TGA, to hear about your time at Roche. I hope everyone listening today has enjoyed the podcast. But where can people, I guess, because you obviously have your consultancy firm, where can people find you or your website? Just let us know that.
Okay. I'll just give you an email address, which is a Gmail address.
Yeah.
ajboots at gmail.com. Just drop me a line if you want some help. And I'm very happy to sort of, for second opinions on things, helping out your reg team where necessary, or the clinical research team in your drug development. So anything from big to small. What really floats my boat is helping people getting new medicines for Australian patients. Just going back to my days in the aged care, that's really been the focus of my career over many years.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Professor.
Thank you.